In the vastness of the European skies, during the darkest days of World War II, an improbable story was about to unfold. It was the year 1944, and the skies over Germany had become extremely dangerous for any Allied aviator who dared to cross them. The German Air Defense Command had transformed that territory into an impenetrable fortress, with detection systems, anti-aircraft batteries, and fighter squadrons patrolling every square kilometer with remarkable precision. In those days, flying an aircraft over enemy territory was not just a military mission. It was a test of survival where few emerged victorious. The German war machine, with all its Prussian efficiency, had developed an air defense system considered by many military experts to be virtually infallible. Radar stations dotted the landscape, their electronic eyes constantly scanning the skies for intruders. Underground command centers coordinated instant responses to any detected threat. Veteran Luftwaffe pilots, some with dozens of confirmed kills, waited at their airfields, ready to take off in a matter of minutes. And the dreaded 88mm batteries, those weapons that had become legendary for their precision and power, formed a defense network that could reach even the highest altitudes. But on a seemingly ordinary day, a young American pilot, newly arrived in the European theater of operations, was about to challenge the entire system. His name was little known, his combat experience was practically non-existent, and his aircraft, though modern, was just one among hundreds crisscrossing the skies in those days. He was a pilot whom his superiors considered still too green, still too inexperienced, still too innocent for the intense realities of aerial warfare. Yet, sometimes in military history, it is precisely these unlikely men who write the most extraordinary chapters. The North American P-51 Mustang was considered by many to be the crown jewel of Allied fighter aviation. With its Rolls-Royce Merlin engine roaring with over 1,400 horsepower, its sleek lines cutting through the air with unparalleled aerodynamic efficiency, and its ability to reach speeds exceeding 680 kilometers per hour, the Mustang had become the symbol of American air dominance. Its silver fuselage gleamed in the sun like metallic lightning, and its 6.50 caliber machine guns represented considerable firepower for any adversary who crossed its path. Our pilot had arrived in England just 3 weeks earlier, part of a replacement group that would fill the ranks of fighter squadrons operating over the continent. During his training in the United States, he had flown for countless hours, practiced aerobatic maneuvers until they became instinctive, fired at fixed and moving targets until his aim was precise. But nothing, absolutely nothing in his training could truly prepare him for what it meant to face veteran pilots in real combat, where every second could be the difference between life and death. Before subscribing to the channel, please leave a comment telling us what time you are watching this documentary, so we can know what time you prefer to watch these incredible stories from military aviation. The mission that day seemed routine in the briefing reports. It was an escort of B-17 heavy bombers, those flying fortresses that carried the industrial war to the heart of Germany. The targets were ball-bearing factories in southern Germany, facilities critical to the German war effort. Dozens of bombers would fly in close formation, their fuselages laden with their operational payloads, while the escort fighters, including our young pilot and his Mustang, formed a protective curtain around the formation. The dawn of that day had painted the sky with shades of orange and pink, colors that contrasted dramatically with the serious nature of the mission ahead. In the briefing, the intelligence officer had marked on the large map the entry and exit routes, the known danger points, the areas where anti-aircraft defenses were especially intense. There were red circles indicating enemy fighter bases, dotted lines showing the most likely interception routes, and notes on the expected weather conditions. Everything seemed planned with military precision, every contingency considered, every risk calculated. When the Mustang's engine roared for the first time that morning, sending vibrations throughout the fuselage and filling the air with the characteristic sound of the Merlin engine, our pilot felt the familiar mix of excitement and apprehension that every fighter pilot knows well. His fingers checked the instruments with the methodical precision learned during training. His eyes scanned the sky above for any anomalies. His hands adjusted the controls until everything seemed perfectly balanced. And then, with a nod to the runway chief, he accelerated down the runway, feeling the raw power of the machine as it gained speed, until finally the wheels left the ground and he was airborne, soaring toward his destination. The formation gathered over the English Channel, dozens of aircraft finding their designated positions with the precision of a rehearsed choreography. The heavy bombers flew in the center, their massive fuselages reflecting the morning light, while the fighters wove a protective pattern around them, like alert guard dogs protecting their flock. The crossing of the channel was uneventful, but all the pilots knew that as soon as they crossed the French coast, they would be entering hostile territory, where every minute would bring new dangers. The first signs of resistance came in the form of anti-aircraft artillery explosions, those dark clouds that suddenly appeared in the sky, each containing fragments that posed a danger to the aircraft. The bombers maintained their close formation, absorbing the damage, some beginning to leave smoke trails but continuing onward. The fighter pilots kept their eyes constantly moving, scanning the sky in all directions, knowing that the real danger would come not from below, but from above, where enemy fighters might be waiting with the sun at their backs. And then it happened. Out of nowhere, or so it seemed, German fighter planes emerged rapidly from the clouds, their engines roaring, their guns firing tracer projectiles. They were Messerschmitt 19 and Focke-Wulf 190, war machines piloted by veterans who knew every trick, every maneuver, every tactical advantage their aircraft could offer. In a matter of seconds, the orderly sky had transformed into a three-dimensional scene of aircraft spinning, diving, climbing, each pilot fighting to gain an advantage over his opponent. Our young pilot saw Focke-Wulf make a pass by the bombers, its weapons leaving a trail of impacts along the fuselage of a flying fortress. Instinctively, he pulled back on the stick and dove in pursuit, his finger tense on the trigger, his eyes fixed on the German cross painted on the tail of the enemy fighter. But the German pilot was experienced, very experienced. With a series of quick and violent maneuvers, he not only escaped the pursuit but managed to turn the tables, and suddenly our pilot found himself the hunted instead of the hunter. Red tracers passed dangerously close to his cabin, so close he could see the bright spots cutting through the air around him. His heart pounded in his chest, adrenaline coursing through his veins. He pulled the Mustang into a tight turn, the GS pressing his body against the seat, his peripheral vision beginning to darken with the force of the maneuver. But the German remained on his tail, persistent, determined, like an experienced driver who had found his target. It was in that moment of controlled panic that something in our pilot changed. The training, those endless hours of practice, began to take over. His movements became more fluid, more instinctive. He pushed the throttle to the limit, feeling the Mustang respond with a surge of speed. He began a series of evasive maneuvers, not random but calculated, each designed to make it harder for the pursuer to aim. Barrel rolls, sudden changes in altitude, S-turns that made the plane scream in protest but gradually began to create distance between him and his attacker. And then, with a maneuver he had practiced hundreds of times but never executed under live fire, he cut the throttle sharply, extended the flaps partially, and let the Mustang decelerate dramatically. The Focke-Wulf, traveling at full speed, overtook him like an express train, and suddenly the positions were reversed. Now it was our pilot who had the enemy in his sights, his finger gripping the trigger, the 6.50 caliber machine guns roaring simultaneously, sending an intense stream of projectiles toward the target. But the German pilot would not be easily intercepted. With reflexes sharpened by dozens of previous combats, he broke the pursuit with a split-S maneuver, diving vertically and rolling at the same time, a maneuver that required not only skill but also nerves of steel, as executing it too low would mean a collision with the ground. Our pilot followed him, determined not to let his adversary escape, but the surrounding sky was becoming increasingly dangerous. Other German fighters had noticed the individual combat and were beginning to converge rapidly. It was at this critical moment that the German ground command became aware of the situation. In the fortified bunkers below, radar operators had been tracking the formation since it crossed the coast. But now one particular aircraft was drawing attention. A Mustang had broken away from the main formation, was flying erratic patterns at low altitude, and seemed to be causing disproportionate problems for several of its best pilots. The commanding officer quickly assessed the situation and made a decision that would change the course of events that day. Through encrypted radio frequencies, orders were transmitted to 3 different interceptor squadrons. The message was clear and direct. That particular Mustang needed to be intercepted with top priority. It wasn't just a tactical matter now. It had become a matter of pride, a matter of demonstrating that the German air defense system could not be challenged with impunity by a single Allied pilot, no matter how skilled or lucky he might be. Our pilot, completely unaware of the storm brewing around him, continued his battle with the original Focke-Wulf. They had descended to less than 1,000 meters in altitude now, flying over the fields and forests of rural Germany at speeds that made the trees below a green blur. Each pilot was trying to gain the slightest advantage over the other, each searching for that second of carelessness, that small mistake that would allow a decisive opportunity. And then, when our pilot finally managed to position himself perfectly, when his sights were aligned and his finger began to press the trigger again, he heard an urgent call from his squadron leader over his radio. The message was alarming. Multiple formations of enemy fighters were converging on his position. He needed to withdraw immediately. He needed to gain altitude and speed and return to the safety of the main formation. But there was a problem. The Focke-Wulf was still there, still a threat, and breaking off the engagement now would mean exposing his most vulnerable rear to enemy fire. It was an impossible choice, the kind of dilemma that defines the crucial moments of aerial combat. Staying and fighting meant facing increasingly worse odds as more enemies arrived. Fleeing meant risking being shot down during the retreat. For a fraction of a second that seemed like an eternity, he weighed his options. His decision was as bold as it was desperate. He pushed the throttle to the absolute limit, begging Merlin for every drop of power he could provide, and pointed the Mustang's nose straight down. He was going for the deck, as the racers called it, flying as low as possible, where speed and surprise would be his only defenses. 300 meters, 200 meters, 100 meters from the ground, the Mustang tore through the air, its wings almost touching the treetops, its shadow dancing across the fields below. The German pilot tried to follow, but the maneuver was extremely risky, too dangerous even for a veteran. He pulled up, searching for a safer altitude, while his arriving comrades tried to intercept the Mustang, which was now flying so low that ground radar operators were losing intermittent contact with it. And there, just a few meters above the ground, our pilot had a surprising realization. Flying so low, he was temporarily safe from attack from above, as no enemy pilot would risk such a steep dive with so little room for recovery. But in the German command centers, frustration was beginning to give way to something close to heightened determination. More than a dozen of their best pilots were now engaged in trying to intercept a single enemy aircraft, and that aircraft continued to elude them. Control officers were constantly sending out interceptor vectors, trying to direct their fighters to advantageous positions, but that Mustang seemed to anticipate every move, turning, climbing, descending in patterns that seemed impossible to predict. A senior officer, a World War I veteran who had seen generations of pilots come and go, watched the radar panels with an expression that mingled admiration and dismay. He had seen many skilled pilots in his long career, but there was something different about this one. It wasn't just skill, it wasn't just luck. It was a combination of instinct, courage, and perhaps a dash of inspired madness that was allowing this young aviator to defy the entire German military machine. Through the communication circuits, increasingly urgent orders were transmitted. Divert all available resources. Create an airbox from which he cannot escape. Saturate his area with so much fire that he has no choice but to be hit. Use the anti-aircraft batteries in coordination with the fighters. Do whatever it takes but shoot that plane down. And so one of the most intense aerial combats of the war began to unfold. Our pilot, still flying dangerously low, began to realize that no matter where he turned, there was always another German fighter waiting, always another set of tracers cutting through the air in his direction. The sky around him was literally full of enemies, as if the entire Luftwaffe had decided to make him their personal target that day. His hands were firmly on the controls, his eyes in perpetual motion, his mind processing information and making split-second decisions. Turn here, dive there, climb now, roll, glide, accelerate, decelerate. Each maneuver was executed with increasing precision, each decision made with a clarity that surprised even himself. It was as if combat had awakened something within him, some primal survival instinct that was guiding his actions beyond any formal training. Miles behind him, the bomber formation had completed its mission and was beginning its long journey back to England. His squadron leader had reluctantly ordered the group to move on, unable to risk the entire squadron on a rescue attempt that would likely be futile. In the mission report that would be written later, our pilot would be listed as missing in action, presumably shot down over enemy territory. But our pilot had no intention of becoming a statistic that day. He had survived the first 20 minutes of what seemed like an impossible battle, and some stubborn part of his personality refused to accept defeat. He began to think not only about immediate survival, but about escape, about finding a way back through hundreds of kilometers of hostile territory to the safety of Allied lines. A quick glance at his instrument panel between evasive maneuvers led him to rapidly assess his situation. Fuel was about halfway down, still sufficient if he could maintain a direct course, but each minute of this combat was consuming the precious liquid at an alarming rate. Ammunition was low. He had fired several bursts during previous engagements, and more worryingly, he noticed that some of his indicators showed minor damage to the aircraft, likely from fragments of projectiles that had passed dangerously close. In the German command center, another officer had assumed personal coordination of the operation. He was a man known for his cold, methodical efficiency. He studied the Mustang's movement pattern over the past 15 minutes and began to identify trends. The Allied driver was gradually, almost imperceptibly, moving westward. He was trying to get home. Very well, thought the German officer, then we'll set a trap in his path. Orders were dispatched to position fighter jets in layered altitudes along the Mustang's predicted escape route. Simultaneously, anti-aircraft batteries were alerted to prepare a corridor of fire. And to ensure success, a reserve squadron of their most experienced pilots was placed on high alert, ready to take off at the first sign that the Mustang was attempting its final escape. Our pilot, through a combination of intuition and careful observation, began to sense that something was changing. The attacks, though still intense, seemed to be taking on a different pattern. It was as if the Germans were no longer simply trying to shoot him down, but rather to steer him in a specific direction. The realization struck him like a lightning bolt. They were setting a trap. At that moment, he made a decision that defied all conventional military logic. Instead of continuing westward toward friendly lines, he turned sharply south, flying deeper into enemy territory. It was such an unexpected, counterintuitive maneuver that it took German air traffic controllers several precious seconds to realize what had happened and begin to react. Those few seconds of confusion were enough for our pilot to create some distance from his immediate pursuers. He continued south, flying low over a landscape that was becoming increasingly mountainous. The Alps began to appear on the horizon, their snow-capped peaks offering both promise and danger. In those mountains, he could use the terrain to his advantage, flying through valleys where enemy fighters would have difficulty following him. But a wrong navigation, an unexpected gust of wind, and he could easily become just another aircraft lost in the mountains. The German officer in charge of the operation watched the Mustang change direction with a mixture of reluctant respect and growing frustration. He immediately began to reposition his resources, but he was starting to realize something unsettling. They had committed an extraordinary number of aircraft to this pursuit. Every minute that passed was a minute that those fighters were not protecting other, more important targets. It was becoming a matter of conserving resources versus wounded pride. Through his headset, he heard the tense voices of his pilots, some reporting fuel problems, others indicating they had lost visual contact with the target. One of his most decorated aces, a man with over 50 confirmed victories, delivered a message that perfectly summed up the situation. "This is no rookie pilot," the crackling voice said through the radio. "Whoever he is, he knows exactly what he's doing." But for the German command, admitting defeat was not an acceptable option. New orders were issued. Units returning from other missions were diverted to intercept the Mustang. Even some night bombers that were preparing for night missions were considered for deployment, although this idea was quickly discarded as impractical. Meanwhile, our pilot had entered the mountainous region, and the flight had become an even more intense test of nerves. He flew through narrow valleys, the mountain slopes rising menacingly on both sides, sometimes so close that he could see individual trees. The Mustang, with its excellent cockpit visibility and responsive controls, proved ideal for this type of flight, but still demanded absolute concentration. A moment of distraction and he could easily collide with a hidden slope or peak. The German fighter planes that attempted to follow it into the mountainous terrain discovered it was far more difficult than it had seemed. Several were forced to abandon the pursuit when they found themselves dangerously close to collisions with the terrain. Others, reluctant to risk their planes and their lives in such an extremely dangerous chase, orbited above the mountains, waiting for a safer opportunity to intercept when the Mustang emerged. After what seemed like hours but was only another 40 minutes of flight through the mountains, our pilot finally emerged on the western side of the mountain range. Ahead of him stretched territory that, although still technically under German control, was much closer to the Allied lines. His fuel gauge was now dangerously low, entering the red zone, which indicated that he had, at best, another 20 or 30 minutes of flight before the engine began to sputter and die. But the German command wasn't about to let him escape now, not after all that had been invested in this pursuit. A final group of interceptors was launched in his path, fresh drivers in fully fueled machines, with clear instructions to intercept that Mustang with top priority. This would be the final showdown, the ultimate test of whether our driver could complete his improbable escape. The two groups of aircraft converged over the fields of eastern France. This time, our pilot didn't attempt elaborate evasive maneuvers. He had no more fuel to waste, no more time for prolonged combat. Instead, he pushed the throttle to the absolute limit, asking the Merlin for one last demonstration of its legendary power. The Mustang responded with a roar that seemed defiant, leaping forward with an acceleration that pushed him back against his seat. The German fighters dove to intercept, their guns already firing, but something extraordinary happened. The Mustang, perhaps aided by the slight extra altitude our pilot had gained by leaving the mountains, perhaps driven by its pilot's desperation, perhaps simply displaying the superior qualities that made it one of the best fighters of the war, began to pull ahead. Slowly at first, then more decisively, it began to leave its pursuers behind. The German pilots pushed their own planes to the limit, but the Mustang had a crucial top speed advantage at that altitude, and that advantage was now making all the difference. Meter by meter, kilometer by kilometer, the distance between the Allied fighter and its pursuers began to increase. The tracer projectiles that had been so dangerously close began to fall shorter, then to miss it altogether. In the German command center, the officer in charge watched helplessly as the dot on the radar representing the Mustang moved further and further west, further and further out of range of their interceptors. He picked up the microphone to transmit one last order to his pilots, but then hesitated. What order could he give? They had already done everything humanly possible. Slowly, reluctantly, he put the microphone back in its place. As difficult as it was to admit, the Allied pilot had won. The final transmission sent to the German fighters was brief and contained an admission rarely made by the German military machine. Break contact and return to base. We cannot saturate you. Those words, "We cannot saturate you," would echo in German military records as a rare acknowledgement of defeat, an admission that sometimes a single determined individual could defy even the most formidable system. Our pilot, still flying towards friendly lines, gradually began to realize that there were no more tracers cutting through the air around him, no more roar of nearby enemy engines. He looked in his side mirrors and saw only empty sky. They had given up. He had, against all odds, escaped. But his ordeal was not yet over. The fuel gauge was now trembling in the void, the engine occasionally sputtering worryingly. He was over territory that should now be controlled by the Allies, but he wasn't entirely sure. And he knew that, with the amount of fuel he had left, he probably wouldn't make it back to his base in England. He would have to make an emergency landing somewhere in France, hoping it would be in liberated territory and not in a remaining pocket of German resistance. Ahead, he saw a relatively flat field, free of major obstacles. It would be risky, but he had no choice. He put the Mustang on a smooth approach, extended the flaps, reduced speed as much as he dared without stalling. The engine was now clearly out of fuel, coughing and sputtering. In the last few seconds before touchdown, the Merlin finally died completely, and the Mustang became a glider, a very heavy and very fast glider. The impact was hard but not catastrophic. The Mustang bounced once, twice, then rolled awkwardly across the plowed field, its propeller biting into the earth, its fuselage protesting with sounds of bent metal. Finally, after what seemed an impossible distance, the plane came to a stop at an odd angle, its left wing touching the ground, but essentially intact. Our pilot sat in silence for a long moment, his hands still gripping the controls, his heart still pounding in his chest, hardly able to believe he was alive, that he was on the ground, that he had survived. Then, slowly, methodically, he began to unfasten his safety harness, opened the cockpit canopy, and staggered down onto French soil. Local farmers, who had observed the emergency landing from a safe distance, began to approach cautiously. When they saw the American markings on the plane and realized the pilot wasn't German, their expressions changed from caution to joy. They began speaking rapidly in French, words our pilot didn't fully understand, but the tone of welcome and relief was universal. In the following hours, he would be taken to a nearby American Army unit, where his account of the mission would be listened to with growing incredulity by intelligence officers. The more than 2-hour flight over enemy territory, the multiple battles, the pursuit through the mountains. It all seemed more like fiction than fact. But the damaged plane in the French field was concrete proof that something extraordinary had truly happened. Messages were relayed back to his unit in England, informing them that the pilot who had been listed as missing was alive and had returned to friendly lines. When he finally arrived back at his base days later, transported by a series of military vehicles through liberated France and then across the Channel, he was greeted not only by his own unit but by senior officers who had flown in specifically to hear him tell his story firsthand. In the following months, as the war in Europe drew to a close, the story of the young pilot who had escaped what seemed to be an impossible trap spread through the Allied fighter squadrons. It became a story told in briefings to inspire other pilots, a demonstration that training, courage, and a bit of luck could sometimes overcome overwhelming odds. On the German side, reports were written analyzing what had gone wrong that day. How had a single enemy fighter managed to escape an operation that had involved dozens of their best pilots and significant resources? Conclusions varied. Some attributed it to the superiority of the Mustang as a fighter platform. Others pointed to failures in coordination between different units. Some officers suggested that the growing shortage of aviation fuel had prevented a more prolonged and effective pursuit. But some of the German drivers who had actually faced that Mustang that day had a different explanation. They had encountered an exceptional driver, someone who combined natural skill with cold courage and the ability to think quickly under extreme pressure. He was the kind of driver who only appears occasionally, but when he does, he can change the course of entire battles. Our pilot, for his part, never considered himself a hero. For him, it had simply been a matter of doing what was necessary to survive. He had used his training, trusted his plane, and made decisions when decisions needed to be made. But in the quiet hours afterward, when he reflected on that day, he recognized that there was something more at stake as well. He had been lucky, extraordinarily lucky, and he wouldn't forget it. The war eventually ended, as all wars eventually end. The men who had fought in it, on both sides, returned home to try to rebuild their lives in a world that had been permanently altered by the conflict. Our pilot returned to the United States, where he was greeted with ceremonies and medals, newspaper interviews, and speeches. But the celebrations soon passed, and he had to find his place in a world at peace. Decades later, when war veterans gathered to share their stories, he was still frequently asked to recount that day. And he would, though always with the caveat that memory can distort events, that what seemed like hours under the stress of combat might have been only minutes, that heroism in the heat of the moment often doesn't seem so heroic when examined in the cold light of hindsight. But for those who listened, whether they were young military pilots studying aviation history, aviation enthusiasts fascinated by stories of World War II, or simply people interested in tales of human courage under extreme conditions, the account was always inspiring. It was a reminder that even in the darkest moments, even when all seems lost, the human spirit has a remarkable capacity not only to persevere but to triumph. The skies over Europe, which had once been the scene of so many desperate battles, had long since been peaceful. The old German and Allied air bases had been transformed or abandoned. The men who had fought in those skies, when they gathered now, did so not as enemies but as comrades who shared the unique bond of those who had seen combat. And in aviation museum exhibits around the world, old P-51 Mustangs lay dormant, their carefully restored fuselages, their propellers still silent objects of admiration and respect. Visitors gazed at these machines and tried to imagine what it must have been like to fly them in combat. But the reality of that experience remained beyond imagination for those who had never lived it. Our story, like all great war stories, is more than just an account of aerial combat. It is a story about human determination, about an individual's refusal to accept defeat, even when all logic suggested that defeat was inevitable. It is about the training and preparation that allow humans to function effectively even under the most extreme stress. It is about how machines, whether warplanes or air defense systems, are only as effective as the humans who operate them. And perhaps more importantly, it's a story that reminds us that in the most crucial moments, when everything is at stake, it's the fundamental human qualities, courage, resolve, creativity under pressure, that make the ultimate difference. Systems can fail, machines can be surpassed, but the human spirit, when truly tested, has the capacity to achieve feats that seem impossible before they are accomplished. The young pilot, who started that day as just another inexperienced substitute, ended up as an example that experience is not always equivalent to skill, that veterans can be outperformed by rookies who have the rare gift of maintaining absolute calm when everything around them is chaos, and that sometimes, just sometimes, the underdog really does win against all odds. In the years that followed the war, he would live a long and productive life. He would marry, raise a family, build a career. But there would always be that day, that extraordinary flight, as a point of reference in his memory, a moment when he had truly been tested and had not failed. And although he rarely spoke of it unless asked, it was always there, shaping his understanding of himself and his capabilities. For military historians studying air warfare over Europe, this incident would become a fascinating footnote, an example of how individual events can sometimes defy statistical patterns and tactical expectations. For aeronautical engineers, it would be further proof of the exceptional qualities of the P-51 Mustang, which not only won combat but allowed its pilots to survive when survival seemed impossible. And for each new generation of military aviators, it would be a story passed down, not as a lesson in specific tactics, for tactics change with technology, but as a lesson in the spirit that every combat aviator must cultivate. The ability to maintain composure under pressure. The skill to make quick decisions with incomplete information. The courage to execute risky maneuvers when necessary. And perhaps above all, the absolute refusal to give up while there is still a chance, however small, of survival. So when we think about that day in the skies over Germany, when an entire military command was unable to capture a single pilot in a single plane, we must remember that we are witnessing something rare and precious. We are seeing a moment when an individual, through a combination of skill, determination, and yes, a good measure of luck, transcended the limitations that should have confined him. It was, in every way, an improbable triumph. But then again, history is full of improbable triumphs, moments when the expected outcome was defied by individuals who simply refused to accept what seemed inevitable. And that is precisely why we tell these stories, why we preserve these memories, why we honor those who show us what is possible when the human spirit is truly tested. The European skies, which witnessed so many tragedies during those dark years, also witnessed moments of triumph that remind us of humanity's capacity for greatness. And on this particular day, when the German command was forced to admit that it could not saturate a single target, when a rookie pilot demonstrated that courage and determination can sometimes overcome experience in superior numbers, the skies were the stage for one of those unforgettable demonstrations. And so, looking back through the decades, we can see that day for what it truly was. Not just an aerial combat, not just a successful evasion, but a testament to human potential. A reminder that within each of us, waiting to be called upon in moments of extreme need, lies a reserve of strength and capability that we may not even know we possess until we are tested. And when we are tested, when everything is at stake, that is when we discover who we truly are. May the Lord God bless all those who served, who survived, and who did not survive, in those distant skies. May their stories continue to inspire future generations, reminding us both of the significant cost of war and of the remarkable capacity of the human spirit to persevere even in the most desperate circumstances. And may we never forget the lessons they taught us through their sacrifice and courage.